Between September of 1955 and March of 1957, the United States Air Force flew a live nuclear reactor over New Mexico and Texas 47 times. The reactor went critical in flight for 89 hours. The crew sat behind 12 tons of lead and rubber to find out how much radiation got through. This was not a test of a nuclear-powered aircraft. The aircraft they were planning to build, the Convair X-6, would never fly. The Soviets would try the same thing 4 years later. They would fail too. This is the story of the Aircraft Nuclear Propulsion program, the only aircraft ever to fly with a live nuclear reactor on board, and why no one has tried again since 1957. In May of 1946, the United States Army Air Forces opened a program called NEPA, Nuclear Energy for the Propulsion of Aircraft. The strategic bomber problem was simple to state. A bomber over Moscow had to take off from a base the Soviets could not reach. Far away meant long flights. Long flights meant a lot of fuel. A lot of fuel meant a heavy aircraft, slower, easier to intercept, shorter in reach. A nuclear reactor solved the fuel problem. A fission reactor produced more energy than a B-29's entire fuel load and never ran out. An aircraft built around one could orbit the polar route indefinitely. Impossible to intercept by attrition. But a reactor heavy enough to power an aircraft needed shielding heavy enough to kill the math. Shielding added weight. More weight needed more reactor. More reactor needed more shielding. So the Air Force decided to find out how close they could get. The platform was the Convair B-36 Peacemaker, the largest piston-engine bomber ever produced. Wingspan 230 feet. Payload 72,000 pounds. The only American aircraft of the 1950s that could lift a nuclear reactor and its shielding. The Air Force took serial number 51-5712 into the Convair plant at Fort Worth and modified it. They replaced the cockpit with a sealed, shielded crew compartment, 12 tons of lead, rubber, and steel around 5 seats. They installed a 1-megawatt air-cooled reactor in the aft bomb bay, the Aircraft Shield Test Reactor, built by Oak Ridge. 35,000 pounds. It was not connected to the engines. The B-36 propulsion was unchanged. The reactor was a passenger. On July 20, 1955, the NB-36 took off from Carswell Air Force Base for the first time. The reactor was on board. It was not yet running. The first flight with the reactor operating happened 2 months later, on September 17, 1955. From that day until March of 1957, the NB-36 flew 47 test flights, 215 hours of flight time. The reactor was operated during 89 of those hours. The flight test corridors ran over the sparsely populated terrain of West Texas and southern New Mexico. On every reactor operating flight, the NB-36 was escorted by a second aircraft carrying personnel to secure any crash site before civilians could reach it. The reason for the flights was instrumentation. Sensors throughout the aircraft measured how much neutron and gamma radiation made it through the shielding, into the crew compartment, the fuel tanks, the electronics. The reactor was tuned up and down through its power range to map the dose response. The shielding worked. The crew received doses well below the Atomic Energy Commission's operating limits. The aircraft systems tolerated the radiation, but every flight confirmed what the engineers had already suspected from the weight figures. The shielding was the problem. The actual nuclear-powered aircraft was supposed to be the Convair X-6. The NB-36 carried its reactor as a passenger. The X-6 would carry it as an engine. General Electric's direct air cycle ran air through the reactor core and out the nozzle, simple, powerful, radioactive exhaust. Pratt & Whitney's indirect air cycle ran a coolant loop between reactor and engines. Heavier, complex, clean exhaust. At Test Area North in the Idaho desert, a 350-foot wide hangar was constructed to house the X-6. A 15,000-foot runway was planned for its takeoffs and landings. By 1960, the X-6 had no airframe metal cut. The engine teams were still iterating on designs that kept getting heavier as shielding requirements grew. The Convair team in Fort Worth had a hangar. They had a planned runway. They did not have an aircraft. On March 26, 1961, in a special budget message to Congress, President John F. Kennedy canceled the Aircraft Nuclear Propulsion program. 15 years and about $1 billion have been devoted to the attempted development of a nuclear-powered aircraft. But the possibility of achieving a militarily useful aircraft in the foreseeable future is still very remote. 15 years had cost $1.04 billion, funded jointly by the Air Force, the Atomic Energy Commission, and the Navy. By the time Kennedy made the cancellation, the strategic argument for a nuclear-powered bomber had already been answered by a different weapons system. The intercontinental ballistic missile delivered the same payload over the same range, at a fraction of the cost, and without a crew. The NB-36H had already been scrapped 4 years earlier. The hangar at Test Area North was empty. The runway was never built. The Aircraft Nuclear Propulsion program was over. 6 weeks after Kennedy canceled the American program, the Soviet Union flew its own version. A modified Tupolev Tu-95 Bear, designated Tu-95 LAL, Lyushya Atomnaya Laboratoria, the Flying Atomic Laboratory. Between May and August of 1961, the Tu-95LAL flew 34 research flights with a reactor in its bomb bay. Like the NB-36H, the reactor was not connected to the engines. Like the NB-36H, the goal was to measure shielding effectiveness. The Soviet engineers reached the same conclusion the American engineers had reached 4 years earlier. The shielding mass made the strategic case impossible. Their planned nuclear-powered aircraft, the Tu-119, was never built. The engineering problem that killed both programs has not been solved. A reactor heavy enough to be useful is still too heavy to fly. The intercontinental ballistic missile is still cheaper, still faster, and still does not need a crew. The 47 flights the NB-36H made over New Mexico and Texas remain the only manned American flights ever conducted with a live nuclear reactor on board. The Crusader was a test of whether the impossible was possible. The answer was no. If you want more military aviation engineering, the decisions that shaped every jet you know, subscribe to BingoFuel.